Well, so who is Pete Buttigieg? Well, if you're closely following the lead up to the 2020 US elections, then that is someone whom you should be familiar with already. If not, well, let's just say, if elected, the 38-year-old taking on the former Vice President Joe Biden and the US Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren could become the first openly gay president of the United States. WION takes you through some of his career's highlights. Well, the millennial mayor is in the race for the White House. His political journey in the big league started when he was just 29. But first, let's get one thing right: how to pronounce his name. Buttigieg. Donald Trump went as far as to say that his last name was unpronounceable.
So what's Buttigieg? Buttigieg. Buttigieg. You know that you pronounce it, they say, I heard some guy saying, no, because it's an unpronounceable name. That's why they call him Mayor Pete. Right? Mayor Pete. Mayor Pete. Mayor Pete! I've had you up to here, Mayor Pete. No, Buttigieg is leading. How does No, you say it this way. You say it... They call him Mayor Pete because nobody can pronounce his last name.
Well, he also speaks one word and its opposite in close succession in the same sentence, perhaps to simulate a poetic effect.
Going to get there by bringing together an American majority ready for something different, united not only by who we are against, but by what we are for.
Well, the young Midwestern mayor is a Harvard and Oxford graduate and a Rhodes Scholar. He had announced his presidential bid in April last year. His claim attracted unlikely early attention from both Democrats and Republicans. Buttigieg served as mayor of South Bend, Indiana for 2 terms. He was first elected to the position in 2011. He then cut short his stint, took leave of absence and was deployed in Afghanistan for 7 months as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy. He was re-elected as mayor for a second term in 2015. This was also when he officially came out and became a symbol of the LGBTQ community. But what is his campaign all about? To start with, Mayor Pete wants net zero emissions from the world's largest economy as early as 2050. This is significant because it is a position not many mainstream Democrats have taken. He is a startup-friendly and, interestingly, union-friendly lawmaker. Again, not a position that many U.S. presidential candidates have taken before. He also wants to ban all assault-style weapons, this being one of the most significant demands of families affected by recent gun violence. When it comes to healthcare, Pete calls it Medicare for all who want it, meaning private health insurance would still exist, but a nationwide government healthcare plan would take precedence. And finally, Pete is one of the many Democrat candidates who want to reinstate the Obama-era protections for immigrants seeking refuge and high-paying jobs. So what are his chances of becoming the Democratic nominee for president in 2020? The leads from the Iowa caucus explain it better. Pete Buttigieg and Bernie Sanders are leading. So far, 71% of the precincts from Iowa have polled. The data shows Buttigieg on 26.8 with Bernie Sanders at 25.2, slim margin there. Elizabeth Warren is third at 18.4%, Joe Biden fourth at 15.4%. Remember, the Iowa caucus represents the first stage of choosing the Democratic nominee, the first among a string of state-by-state contests that will help narrow down the 11-man race when it finally culminates in Wisconsin. Iowa is where the twice-elected former U.S. President Barack Obama burst into the scene almost out of nowhere. And while final tabulations will most likely change, Buttigieg can claim some note of victory and recall as one of the key figures of the 2020 presidential campaign. So that, of course, has been a surprise element to this campaign, the fact that Pete Buttigieg is coming up as a frontrunner in the Democratic presidential election. No one would have thought of this until the results started pouring in from Iowa. Everyone thought that the favorite still remained Bernie Sanders, who is, of course, doing marginally as well as, Pete, but it is, of course, a tight race for the top. And Ray Locker, senior journalist, is now joining us live from Washington, the latest on this. And Ray, thanks very much for talking to us this evening. Now that I've finally got his name right, nobody would have thought in this race that Pete Buttigieg would, somehow come up as the front runner, and Bernie Sanders and others would be trailing. Not trailing, but would be behind him.
Right. Well, I mean, he's an incredibly intelligent, compelling candidate, and that people, when they heard him talk and listened to his ideas, thought, why not this guy with the hard-to-pronounce name? He's raised a lot of money relative to the other candidates. He's raised more money than Joe Biden, more money than Elizabeth Warren. The only person he really trails is Bernie Sanders. So he's demonstrated to a lot of people that he has potential as a candidate. Whether that translates into a victory in New Hampshire on Tuesday, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of different hurdles he has to overcome, but he's done a good job so far.
Right, he's done a good job so far. And what do you think about some of the promises that he's made, whether it's on healthcare or social security or other issues like the LGBT community? His promise is very different from, obviously, the Republicans, but also at variance with some of the policy prospects that other candidates in the Democratic side have come up with.
Right. He would be more moderate on some of those key issues, particularly health care and Medicare for all, which is something that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have been promoting. I think Buttigieg favors something more along the lines of the Obamacare that we have right now, that plan. He's obviously different. Well, he's gay, so he's different on some of those LGBTQ issues than other people, but not significantly. He's now seen as a younger, more moderate alternative to Sanders and Warren and Joe Biden.
Right. And then do you think that his prospects are certainly bright? I know this is the first caucus, an important one nonetheless, but going forward, do you think that he could be in a tight race with Bernie Sanders for the final selection?
I think he has a chance to do that. The big tests are Nevada and South Carolina, where there are a lot more minority voters, Hispanic voters in Nevada, black voters in South Carolina. And Mayor Pete Buttigieg has not traditionally done well with those groups of people. That's not to say that he can't do well. Most Democratic primary voters want somebody they think can beat Donald Trump in November, and that's the sole criterion they're going to look at. So, he has some hurdles in front of him, but doing well in Iowa makes a lot of those other things easier to accomplish.
Right, and certainly he is a charismatic leader with some very moderate to liberal thoughts on issues that matter, like from immigration and otherwise. But in the race to the White House and to actually beat Donald Trump, who would be a more formidable candidate, according to you?
Well, that's really hard to say. I mean, you have to sell yourself to voters in your own party, and if you can't do that, the whole electability argument doesn't really matter. I mean, when you look at some of the other people who ran, who aren't running anymore, on paper, they look like somebody who would do well. Steve Bullock, the Montana governor, moderate guy, successful in a red state, he would have had a chance. Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, another, interesting candidate. Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, I mean, they all had attributes that would have made them a strong November candidate, but they couldn't close the deal even before the votes were cast. So, it's hard to say now. Buttigieg has a good chance because he aligns fairly well on the issues, but we've never had a gay nominee for president, and we don't really know what that means in a general election.
Right, absolutely. And of course, similarities already being drawn between him and Barack Obama's campaign from Iowa caucus. Ray Locker, thanks very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts on what the Democratic presidential caucus is looking like at the moment. Thanks very much for that.
pleasure.